I want to ask you a question. How many different ways are there to teach? Let me just read what Shoghi Effendi says. There is no one method one can follow all through, but there should be as many ways of approach as there are types of individual seekers. Isn't that interesting? There are as many ways of approach as there are types of individual seekers. Sometimes we tend to think, oh, when you teach, you must always do this. Or when you teach, you must always say that. Or we even try to tell people, this is what you must always do. And yet, here Shoghi Effendi says there are as many ways of teaching as there are types of individual seekers. He goes on to say, flexibility and variety of method is therefore an essential prerequisite for the success of every teaching activity. Now, why do you think first you have to listen and love? Because how are you going to be flexible and adaptable if you don't first listen? In other words, the person is the one that dictates the teaching method, not you. We think that we have a teaching method that we've decided upon and we're going to use it. And here, Shoghi Effendi says, no, the person dictates the teaching method. And you figure out what that is by listening and loving. There was one particular Baha'i who had to go travel teaching to India. And so he went to Abdu'l-Baha and he said, Abdu'l-Baha, please tell me how to teach the Indians. Tell me what to say. And Abdu'l-Baha said, when you go to India, look into their eyes. Look straight into their eyes. And then love them. And he says, and then see my face. And then open your mouth and speak, and the words will come to you. And the interesting thing is, this person asked Abdu'l-Baha what to say, and Abdu'l-Baha didn't tell him what to say. He didn't tell him what to say. He told him what to do. And he told him to look right into the person's eyes and to love them, because he wanted him to listen and love and find the beauty inside. Then he said, see my face. He put himself in there. He said, see my face. Then open your mouth and the words will come to you. In other words, there are forces, there are spiritual forces that we can draw upon, which are far more powerful than merely just memorizing things by rote. That we can become a channel, and Abdu'l-Baha says, use me this way. But interestingly, he said, you first have to look at the person and love the person, and then call on me. In other words, he's not just going to guide you if you're not going to do a few things. You know that you can't steer a car that's not in motion. If you take a car outside and it's parked and it's not moving, does the steering wheel do anything at all? No, but as soon as the car is put into motion, then the steering wheel can work. You have to put yourself in motion to listening and loving the person. Then perhaps he will be able to guide you. Now, you cannot then learn how to teach by copying one story of Abdu'l-Baha. Rather, you have to look at the totality of the way in which he taught and see what are his methods, because quite often the method of teaching requires that you get them to speak. Remember, it says, first I listen and love. That's the first quality. But not everybody is just going to speak. Sometimes they may be quiet. And so you have to have skills to enable them to speak. Sometimes they will ask a question and we hear one word and we immediately pounce with the entire Baha'i revelation. We pounce on them because we latched onto one word. And when someone asks a question, the best thing sometimes to do is to ask them a question about that question, rather than immediately try to answer it. Because quite often when someone asks a question, there's a lot more to it. It's like the tip of an iceberg. And who can tell me what size is the tip of an iceberg in relation to the iceberg? Exactly. It's 1/10. It's a scientific law that the tip of an iceberg always tells you how big the iceberg is. So many times when someone asks a question, say, oh, there's a whole iceberg there. I know there was a captain of a ship that underestimated the tip of an iceberg. And unfortunately, the ship went down. We do this sometimes when we teach. We underestimate the tip of the iceberg, and we don't first try and assess what's going on. So you need to have skills to enable people to keep talking. And it's interesting that when someone says something, if you say, have you thought about this before? Or what do you think about this? Or how do you feel about that? Or I can see this is of very interest to you. You have to have various skills to enable them to talk because you want to listen in love. And to listen in love, you have to be interested in what they're going to say, not what you're about to say. And if you do this, people respond because people love it when you are interested in them, when you're genuinely interested in them. And so this is an important skill that we can learn the way Abdu'l-Baha taught. You remember Shoghi Effendi said he was wakeful and attentive in his early intercourse? So this is a great skill that we have to acquire. Sometimes when someone asks a question, perhaps you don't even need to answer the question, because your skill might say, well, maybe that's not really what they're asking. Sometimes people will ask a question, and the face value of the words of the question might be one thing, but maybe the thing they're really saying is, I want you to think I'm important, or I want you to think I'm intelligent. Sometimes they ask a question and they don't even want the answer. Let me read you a story from Muriel Ives Barrow Newhall's Recollections of Abdu'l-Baha. She says, as an example of the methods of Abdu'l-Baha's teaching, my father was having difficulty understanding the matter of detachment. Just what were we supposed to become detached from? We were taught not to become isolated and detached as were the monks in a monastery. It was also an obligation to work and support those dependent upon us. So where did detachment fit into this picture? One day, Father asked Abdu'l-Baha about this. They were walking up Broadway after a meeting, and Abdu'l-Baha made no answer. After walking a few blocks, Father repeated his question. Still no answer. They reached 76th Street, where the Kinneys lived, and turned left to West End Avenue. They mounted the outside steps, and Father asked for a third time. Abdu'l-Baha reached the front door and opened it and started in. He went to the inner stair and up to his room. Father pattered along after him. They reached the second floor, and turning up on the third, Father followed doggedly behind. Abdu'l-Baha finally entered his room, and Father closed in on his heels. And there the master turned and said, Mr. Ives, are you interested in detachment? Father's face turned scarlet, and he was silent. He couldn't say he was, and he didn't want to say he wasn't. Isn't that interesting? He wasn't really interested, and Abdu'l-Baha wanted to know first. Sometimes people ask things, and it's not really what's in their heart. In other words, Abdu'l-Baha, he quite clearly understood what was in people's hearts. And you think that we can't have the same intuition? I don't think so. I think that if you listen to people and you love people and find the beauty inside them, you know what is their true capacity and what they're interested in. And so this means that teaching is entirely about love. It's entirely about humility. It's entirely about lowliness. In fact, all of the qualities that everyone has been guessing that I haven't talked about, they're all encompassed in teaching. But once you get to this quality of love and you start to teach, we find Abdu'l-Baha had many other qualities which I find fascinating. The first is that Abdu'l-Baha was extremely scientific in his method of teaching. Scientific method means truth is explored in a particular way in which truth is studied, and then there's a certain method whereby we verify this truth. And one of the problems that religion has is with language. Truth is not easily conveyed because you say one word, it means one thing to one person and another to another and another person to another. And in fact, many religious arguments just end up on differences of understanding of language. But Abdu'l-Baha seemed to always define his terms before using them. And he always listed things. So if he wanted to talk about love, he said there's 4 kinds of love. If he wanted to talk about unity, he said there's 7 kinds of unity. If he wanted to talk about the powers of the human soul, he says there's 5 powers of the human soul. When Abdu'l-Baha does this, he then makes it so easy to explain what he's talking about. For example, when he says there's 3 different kinds of religion, he calls them faith. One is the religion of your family or your background or your nation or whatever. And he says that's weak traditional faith, but it's one kind of religion. He says there's another kind of religion, and that is religion where the person who comes to believe the messenger of God reads their teachings and accepts them. He says that's good, but there's a better kind of religion, and that's the religion of practice. The religion where you actually do what the messenger said. And this is the third kind of religion. And so now we have three completely different concepts. And so now when Abdu'l-Baha says religion, and he says it's good and we need religion, someone else over here doesn't say, what do you mean we need religion? That's the thing we don't need. That's what's causing all the problems, because Abdu'l-Baha has now defined what he means. And true understanding comes. In science, we call this taxonomy. Taxonomy means that first you define the full range of the things that you're doing and make lists. And Abdu'l-Baha was very taxonomic in his method, and all those that study science understand that this is a quality that Abdu'l-Baha had. He didn't use words without making it clear what they meant. Remember, Albert Einstein said, who was a great scientist himself, he said, if you cannot say something simply, you don't know it well enough. And so the art of being able to say profound things simply is also a scientific principle. Shoghi Effendi listed 8 qualities of Abdu'l-Baha's teachings. He says that if we want to teach, we have to do a number of things. He says, first, we have to have sufficiently had individual regeneration. In other words, you first need to regenerate yourself individually, because you cannot set anything on fire if you yourself are not on fire. So he says, having attained sufficiently the individual regeneration, which we've been talking about, which he says is the essential requisite for teaching, he says, let us arise to teach his cause with righteousness, conviction, understanding, and vigor. He says, let this be the paramount and most urgent duty of every Baha'i. Let us make it the dominating passion of our life. Let us scatter to the utmost corners of the earth, sacrifice our personal interests, comforts, tastes, and pleasures, mingle with the diverse kindreds and peoples of the world, familiarize ourselves with their manners, traditions, thoughts, and customs, arouse, stimulate, and maintain universal interest in the movement, and at the same time endeavor by all means in our power, by concentrated and persistent attention, to enlist the unreserved allegiance and active support of the more hopeful and receptive among our hearers. Let us, too, bear in mind the example which our beloved Master has clearly set before us. And so now Shoghi Effendi lists the qualities that Abdu'l-Baha had while teaching. So let's look at these 8 qualities. The first quality Abdu'l-Baha had, he said, is wise and tactful in his approach. Wise and tactful in his approach. Now, what does wise mean and wisdom mean? Abdu'l-Baha said that wisdom means that you speak according to the person's capacity and not beyond it. That's what wisdom. So in his early approach, he's wise. What does tactful mean? You choose your words carefully, and you say things that do not in any way offend the person. He says, too, wakeful and attentive in his early intercourse. And I love this, because now every time I'm teaching, I'm not thinking about what I'm going to say. I'm thinking about go into my wakeful and attentive mode. And why are you going into that wakeful and attentive mode? Because suddenly now you're looking for bridges. You're trying to diagnose. You're trying to find the beauty inside that person. That's why you're wakeful. That's why you're attentive. So that's the second quality. The third, Shoghi Effendi said, was broad and liberal in all his public utterances. And this is a fascinating statement by Shoghi Effendi, that he's pointing out that Abdu'l-Baha had a different approach to public speaking than he did to individual teaching. As you know, a doctor has specific remedies for certain people, and it's not appropriate necessarily to give the same medicine to everybody. But there are certain things that are generally good for everybody. He says here that when Abdu'l-Baha spoke publicly, he was broad and liberal in his public utterances. Therefore, he's making it clear that there are certain Baha'i teachings that are kind of like drink water and get food. They're things that are good for everybody. And these are the things that Abdu'l-Baha used in his public utterances. And so this is very interesting, and we can study Abdu'l-Baha's public teaching and the way he spoke, and we can see, okay, these are the broad and liberal things in the Baha'i teachings that are generally useful. And then we can see that, okay, these other things we teach in the private way. The fourth, he said, cautious and gradual in the unfolding of the essential verities of the cause. And think how gentle the sun is at dawn. What would happen if suddenly it went from night and then it was noonday? Have any of you ever had that happen to you, where you're in total darkness and the light just hits you suddenly? It's terrible, right? He gradually unfolded the teachings according to their capacity. And to find somebody's capacity, you need to just give them a little bit and see how they respond to it. Everybody is on their own path to God. And it's not for us to decide how fast that path is to go. No, we only want to take them from where they are closer to that path. And if that takes a month, a year, a lifetime, or never at all, that's not our job. Our job is to listen and to love them. So Abdu'l-Baha was cautious, and he was gradual in the unfoldment of the essential verities of the cause. Fifth, Shoghi Effendi says that Abdu'l-Baha was passionate in his appeal, yet sober in argument. And I find this fascinating that Shoghi Effendi would notice this, that some people are quite passionate in the way they speak. You ever know some people like that? They're quite passionate in the way they speak, and there's all passion. And sometimes it leaves us cold, which is ironic, because we say it makes no sense, it doesn't appeal to my intellect, it doesn't. And there's other people that are sober, and they have absolutely no passion. And what does sober mean? It means serious, it means logical, and so on. I go to some Baha'i conferences where the talks are brilliant, but there's no passion at all. And I find it leaves me lacking. And sometimes I hear people that have great passion and they don't have this serious side as well. And Shoghi Effendi was drawing our attention to the fact that we as Baha'is need to be able to have both. So those of you that are leaning in the sober side, try to put a little more passion into your talk. Try to balance yourself like a female and male balances. Those of you that have a little passion, maybe you should look at a little more logic and serious and see if you can bring the balance. Most of us have one balance one way or the other. If you can find both, you will be like Abdu'l-Baha, according to Shoghi Effendi, to be passionate in your appeal yet sober in your argument. Sixth, they said confident in tone. Abdu'l-Baha was confident in tone. And confidence is an interesting quality, because Shoghi Effendi said the Baha'i teacher should be all confidence. Therein lies the secret of his success. Because when you are confident, it's not because you're confident in your abilities. It's because you're confident that God is assisting you. What does Baha'u'llah say is the source of courage? He says the source of courage and power is the promotion of the Word of God. When you teach, that's how you get courage. But sometimes we have no courage to teach. And so it becomes an endless loop that nothing happens, because we have no courage to teach. And he says, well, the way to get courage is to teach. And so confidence gives you the understanding of this cyclical process, that when you teach, God will assist you. Then you have confidence, you teach more, and you feel that power. And Abdu'l-Baha was confident in his tone. Seventh, he said Abdu'l-Baha was unswerving in conviction. Unswerving in conviction. He had absolute conviction in what he was teaching. And eight, he said dignified in his manners, that he taught with dignity. So Shoghi Effendi then concludes by saying, such were the distinguishing features of our beloved's noble presentation of the cause of Baha'u'llah. And so this is why I had to include as one of the six Abdu'l-Baha's methods of teaching. Would you agree that Abdu'l-Baha's method of teaching has to be one of the things that we have to learn to emulate? It's not so much that we are good teachers or bad teachers. It's only the extent to which we just copy the example of Abdu'l-Baha. Sometimes we think, oh, that person's naturally a good teacher and I'm not. But in fact, it's only that maybe that person has a few more of these qualities or has learned to do them. But I don't think that Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi and Baha'u'llah would make it mandatory for everyone to teach if everyone couldn't do it. That would be so cruel, don't you think? To say everybody should teach. In fact, Baha'u'llah says, make mention of me on my earth that I may mention you in the next world and stuff, and then you can't do it? Wouldn't that be so terrible? So basically, he's telling us how to do it. It's right here in black and white. Get your fill. Consult the FBI. Have the right DNA. Be bad. Find the Bab and talk like hell. Just 6 things. Memorize those 6 things. Say them to yourself as you're teaching, and you will find that your teaching will change. I want to read you a statement from the Bab. He says, it is better to guide one soul than to possess all that is on earth. And as soon as I'm reading that, I'm saying, hold on, are you sure about that? It's better to guide one soul than possess all that is on earth? Okay, over here, let's put everything that's on earth. Okay, let's put all the wealth and all the money and all the nations and all the houses, everything. Let's just put it over there. And over here, let's put one soul that we have guided to the faith. And the Bab is saying, this one is not worth as much as this? How can that be? How can that be? So the Bab explains. He says, for as long as that guided soul is under the shadow of the tree of divine unity, he and the one who hath guided him will both be recipients of God's tender mercy, whereas possession of earthly things will cease at the time of death. And I say, oh, now I get it. This stuff over here is not going to last very long. This thing here is going to last forever, as long as that soul is guided. So this is an eternal thing, and this is a temporary thing. So often, we don't realize how temporary this life is. I want you to imagine you go into a doctor's office, and there's some magazines on the waiting room table. And there's a rule that you can't take the magazines out of the waiting room. And you reach for a magazine, and somebody grabs it away from you. And you reach for another and they grab it. And then everybody's fighting over the magazines. And somebody has 5 magazines and he can't even read them, but he's still holding on to them. This is what life is like. We're fighting over magazines in the waiting room. That's all we're doing in life. We're fighting over magazines in a waiting room. We're going somewhere else. We have something important to do. The doctor's about to call us. Okay, the doctor's about to call us, and all we're worried about is fighting about the magazines in the waiting room, and that's what's going on in the world. I just look at the world, and I see this is a big waiting room with a lot of old magazines that none of us even want, and we're fighting over them. And so this is what the Bab is telling us. He's telling us that all of this stuff over here is not worth as much as guiding one soul. And so this is a remarkable passage, and he continues to say this: the path to guidance is one of love and compassion, not of force and coercion. So now he's telling you how to do it. He says it's better to have this than to have that, and the path to it is love and compassion. Notice he didn't say the path to it is knowledge and facts and details. The path to this, to gain something that's more valuable than all possessions, is through love and compassion, not through force and coercion. This hath been God's method in the past, and shall continue to be in the future. He causeth him who he pleaseth to enter the shadow of his mercy. Verily he is the supreme protector, the all-generous. There is no paradise more wondrous for any soul than to be exposed to God's manifestation in his day, to hear his verses and believe in them, to attain his presence, which is naught but the presence of God, to sail upon the sea of the heavenly kingdom and his good pleasure, and to partake of the choice fruits of the paradise of his divine oneness. So, basically, we know now that this is the thing. This is the greatest gift of God, according to Abdu'l-Baha. I want to read you that whole passage. Abdu'l-Baha says, whosoever and whatsoever meeting becometh a hindrance to the diffusion of the light of the faith. Have you ever been to any meetings where maybe there's been a little bit of hindrance to the diffusion of light? Ever happened, everyone? 1, 2, 3, yes? Ever happened? Abdu'l-Baha says what to do whenever that happens. Whosoever and whatsoever meeting becometh a hindrance. He says, let the loved ones give them counsel and say, of all the gifts of God, The greatest is the gift of teaching. It draweth us unto the grace of God, and is our first obligation. Of such a gift, how can we deprive ourselves? Nay, our lives, our goods, our comforts, our rest, we offer them all as a sacrifice for the Abha beauty and teach the cause of God. Isn't that a beautiful statement? Because basically God is just so nice to us. God is so that he gives us this gift. I mean, it's nice anyone gives you a gift, but he certainly doesn't have to give this gift to us. If God wanted to, he could zap the whole world and make them Baha'is. I mean, he's all-powerful. I'm sure he can do it. I'm sure he can do it. But for some reason, he allows us to do it. How wonderful does a child feel if a parent gives the child one of the parent's jobs to do? How respected, how loved, how honored the child feels. And this is what God does to us, because he loves us so much that he lets us do his work. And it seems to me that if we're given the faith, and remember, we were given it. Don't think that you're a Baha'i because you're so great and you're so smart and you discovered it first. Baha'u'llah says in the long obligatory prayer, "Thy grace hath raised me up and led me unto thee. Who otherwise am I?" In other words, you are sitting in this room here today because God has chosen you. You are here because God has given you this gift. And he's given you this gift, and he says, can you please give it to some others? And if you take that gift and just hang on to it, then he's not going to mention you in his world. That's what he says. Teaching has nothing to do with trying to convert people. We don't convert anyone. All we do is we bark like dogs. That's all. You're laughing when you say bark like dogs, but the reason I say that is that there was a great teacher of the cause. His name was Harullah, and he came over to America, and he was a fantastic teacher. The power of God flowed through him. And then he got this idea that maybe it was because of his own work that he was doing it, and so he told Abdu'l-Baha, you take the East and I'll take the West, because he felt that this was his faith. And Abdu'l-Baha, he dispatched another teacher to America. His name was Mirza Abu Fazl, who was the most humble man you have ever met. Go and read any story of him and he'll make you cry, because he had greater intellectual power than anyone in the faith, and yet he had greater humility. So he comes over to America and he says to the believers, he says, I want you to imagine you're in a desert at night, and it's totally dark, and there's clouds, and you cannot see anything in the sky, and you don't know where to go. And he says, suddenly you hear in the far distance a dog barking. And so you go closer to the dog barking just by the sound. And you get closer and closer, the dog barking gets louder. And then as you get very close to the dog, you see behind the dog the city lights. And he says, at that point, you don't need the dog anymore. You can see the city yourself and you can go. And he said that me, Mirza Abu Faz, and Harullah are nothing but barking dogs. We're just barking dogs. Everybody has the capacity to see the truth for themselves. We're just barking dogs. And that's all that teaching is. It's just the barking of dogs. Teaching is the act of searching for people that have a common interest, that are attracted to this, not trying to beat your head against the wall with people that are not there, trying to find Baha'is. So you go out and you engage people in meaningful, distinctive conversation about important things to the world. And many people, they only want to talk about shoes and movie stars and all kinds of things. That's fine. And then someone, they eat it up. Just like someone that's dying of thirst and you have some water and they drink it. And then you have found a Baha'i. And then teaching is the act of love, the act of joy, the act of sharing your love for the faith with that person. Now the House of Justice has so blessed us because they understand that teaching is not just about converting and facts. It's about enjoying and sharing the love of service and doing something in the world. So they have created an entire new system whereby we can not invite people to become Baha'is, but to invite them to start serving humanity in our core activities in our studying classes, or invite them to start worshiping God in a regular way in devotional gatherings. So teaching has nothing to do with trying to convert people or coerce people or get them to think something that you would have. No, it's the act of finding those people that are attracted to life. They're attracted to life just like soil is attracted to the plant. And you find them, and now the House of Justice has given us this entire mechanism whereby we can partake of this greatest gift of God. This is why we have to be so grateful to the House of Justice for giving us the 5-year plan, for giving us the means whereby we can enjoy this greatest gift of God. This is the main teaching, that to not teach is the most selfish act one can do in all of creation, in all of spiritual creation. There is no act more selfish than to have been given this gift by God and then not to give it to others. And it's the greatest of all the gifts of God. It's the largest present. You can go home and you can unwrap that present and partake of that gift right now if you study the way Abdu'l-Baha taught. He gave us the method whereby we can partake of this greatest gift of God.